God's Will Fall has a rather unfortunately generic name, but that belies how interesting and intriguing it really is. God's Will Fall also looks like a smorgasbord of differing influences from various popular games of the last few years. That also belies how unusual it is with all of its different pieces coming together in concert. So, what is God's Will Fall? It can be best described as a hack and slash with elements of action RPGs and roguelikes thrown in for good measure, contextualized by storytelling taken right out of Dark Souls and Hollow Knight, wrapped up in a jarringly incongruent art style that would better be suited in something like Fortnite than this. Except for that last element, everything else comes together surprisingly well. The game gives you control of 8 heroes. These 8 heroes, who are randomized on each run, end up washed up on the island, and one of your 8 heroes can enter a dungeon at a time. God's Will Fall, much like Hades before it, sidesteps one of the most common issues with roguelikes, their reliance on procedural generation, by having each dungeon be handcrafted and fixed between runs. The layout and aesthetic of a dungeon never changes. What does change each time though is the difficulty of a dungeon. A dungeon that might have been the easiest during your previous run might end up being the hardest this time around. The difficulty influences which enemies you encounter inside as well, meaning that while the layouts are fixed, the actual enemies you encounter in a dungeon will vary from one run to the other. There's no way to know what difficulty a dungeon has without actually going in once, which leads to some extremely interesting situations thanks to the game's death and relationship systems. The way the game handles death is a blend of permadeath and the kind of corpse running popularized by Dark Souls, and then emulated by games such as Hollow Knight. Once your hero steps into a dungeon, the only way that they can get out is if they get to its end and defeat its final boss. If they die, they're stuck in there. But they are not lost to you. If another hero enters the dungeon and finishes it successfully, they end up saving all the heroes who may have fallen in that dungeon before, so no death is truly permanent, unless all 8 of your heroes end up trapped in these realms, in which case it's game over and this run is done for. God's Will Fall's true stroke of brilliance, though, is in the push for emergent storytelling it represents, which builds upon that permadeath system. Your 8 heroes have different relationships with each other, different backstories. You may have a hero who's tormented in his dreams each night, who ends up being terrified once you're near that dungeon. In this case, you'll find their stats suffering from a debuff if you attempt to use them. Conversely, they may want to prove themselves and see a buff to their stats. Even heroes who may share no special relationship could find themselves buffed or debuffed. If, for example, a friend of theirs went in and didn't emerge out, meaning they died inside, they could get demotivated and suffer depressed stats. Or they could want to avenge that friend and find their stats getting a boost. These systems mesh together really well to create an interlocking framework of emergent narratives that combine to help each run feel different from the last. Much like Hades before it, God's Will Fall achieves this by relying on contextualization to achieve the variation, so that it can deliver a roguelike without forsaking handcrafted level design. God's Will Fall uses other systems married with its narrative design to support its gameplay as well. For example, to discourage turtling and defensive play, which is an issue that often plagues combat-focused games. God's Will Fall ties each dungeon's boss strength to the number of enemies still left alive in that dungeon. In other words, the more enemies you kill, the easier the final boss fight for that dungeon becomes. To encourage offensive play, the game also has a valor system, where even when you lose health, being offensive in combat nets you valor that you can then convert to lost segments of health, meaning very literally, offense can often be the best defense in God's Will Fall. God's Will Fall also makes its dungeons not caves or grottos physically situated on the island you're on, but separate realms in other dimensions accessed by portals on the island, which means that the game is freed from the obligation of adhering to physical coherence, and each dungeon can have lots of variation in aesthetic and theme. As much as Gods Will Fall gets right, there are definitely some missteps too. The biggest one here is the art style. The art style feels very bright and plasticky, like something you might see in a mobile game, or Fortnite, or Orcs Must Die. That is incongruous with the tone the game wants to strike, but in and of itself, that doesn't have to be a problem. The trouble is that the game itself calls attention to it by having a gorgeous art style it uses for its storytelling and world-building segments that adequately strike the balance between feeling dark and foreboding, while also looking like something out of folklore. The game starts with that art style, and then abruptly switches to the Fortnite look. Which, it's fine, and it looks good for what it is, I just don't feel it's as much in tandem with the rest of the package as everything else is. Gods Will Fall also suffers from some bugs, including at least one I encountered as early as the tutorial, where I basically got stuck in a room with the way to move forward not opening, forcing me to restart, though I have hopes that these may be addressed in future updates. The controls can often be finicky, especially the parry, which relies on you rolling towards the enemy at just the right time, an exercise in frustration, especially when compared with the game's lack of a lock-on, which otherwise isn't a problem at all, but does exacerbate the trouble with the parry system. The issues the game does face, however, don't really detract from what it does achieve. Gods Will Fall has an unfortunately bland name, but underneath that unappealing and generic moniker is a tightly designed game with multiple elements working in tandem and marriage to deliver a one-of-a-kind experience that further helps evolve roguelikes and remove the traditional frustrations associated with them.
And that wraps it up. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing to our channel. We upload new videos daily, so make sure you don't miss them by subscribing. We appreciate your support, and we thank you for checking us out.